Morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar addressing the effects of COVID-19 on cybercrime in the Pacific. This is an event organized by PILON and Council of Europe under the framework of GLACY Plus project with the support of our colleagues from the Attorney General's Department in Australia. On behalf of our team organizing this event, let me thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. James Lutui, Director for Public Prosecutions in Tonga, and afterwards to Mr. Virgil Spiridon for the opening remarks on behalf of PILON and Council of Europe. Mr. Lutui, you have the floor. Please unmute your mic.
Thank you. Firstly, a big malo lele from the Kingdom of Tonga. PILON members, friends of PILON, colleagues and friends. It gives me great pleasure to, on behalf of the Kingdom of Tonga, as the current chair of the Cybercrime Working Group of PILON, to make some remarks. Firstly, thank you everyone for joining us today, and I welcome you all. The topic of today's webinar is very timely as we gather to reflect on the impact that COVID-19 has had on cybercrime in our region. The pandemic has not only changed the way we work, the way we travel, the way we socialize, it has also changed the way our criminal justice system works. The way our courts sit and the way legal practitioners present their case. During these unprecedented times, it has become evident more than ever how heavily the world relies on technology and the internet to remain connected whilst physically apart. Unfortunately, we have seen that increased connectivity has also led to increase in transnational crime, technology making criminal activity easier and more pervasive. In today's webinar, we will hear from experts on the challenges encountered by criminal justice authorities in our region while addressing cybercrime issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. We will hear about good practices to combat these challenges, and we will hear about possible solutions to further strengthen the criminal justice response in the region and globally. It is my pleasure to welcome our wonderful speakers for today, and we have with us Mr. Yu Jun-Ki from Interpol, who will share his experience in investigating online money laundering, redefined by the pandemic. We also have Ms. Patricia Femia from Australia's Federal Prosecutions Service, who will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on cybercrime in the Pacific from a criminal justice perspective. And thirdly, we also have Mr. Virgil Spiridon from the Council of Europe, who shall share with us his insights on developing cybercrime legislation in our region that effectively combats the threats we are currently facing. On that note, I wish you the best in the upcoming discussions, and I sincerely hope that the discussions are both constructive and fruitful. I would like to give the floor back to the Council of Europe to moderate the rest of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lutui. We are very happy to be here with you today. We would have liked to be physically present, but for the time being, this has to do it. I am passing the floor now to Virgil Spiridon. He is the head of operations for the Cybercrime Program Office of the Council of Europe, to say some opening remarks on behalf of the Council. Please, Virgil.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the opening of this workshop on behalf of the Council of Europe. Needless to say, also from my side, that this period has been impacted by COVID-19 pandemic, and the Council of Europe, like other international organizations, had to adapt the activities and to move to the online format. However, we continued our efforts to support the reinforcement of capacities of criminal justice authorities to fight against cybercrime in our cybercrime capacity building projects, one of them being Lazy Plus, as you pointed out, a joint initiative of the European Union and the Council of Europe to support countries, criminal justice authorities from the countries to reinforce their capacities. We could not actually afford to let the criminal justice authorities without any assistance in the given context when cyber criminals were heavily involved. Online environment was also the option for many sectors of our societies, whether we are talking about schools, businesses, and other sectors. And cyber criminals exploited these opportunities by intensifying their activities, not necessarily by finding new ways of conducting their illegal businesses, but rather adapting the old ones to the new context. Because if we speak about ransomware, phishing attacks, or cyber attacks, or internet fraud, like selling fake products like masks and sanitizers, these are activities which were there before. It's just they were adapted to the given context. One major target for us in this period for the Council of Europe was the continuation of the negotiations of the second additional protocol, which hopefully soon will be concluded, and the provisions of the new protocol will be shared publicly. The second additional protocol will bring novelty on the international cooperation to enhance actually the international cooperation between states and also with the private sector, which is a big struggle when it comes to access to electronic evidence, and not only in cybercrime investigations. As regards the Pacific Island, this PILON initiative has been supported by the Council of Europe since 2017, of course, together with the countries from the region, and also with the big support from Australia. What we've noticed from the past events and engagements with the countries from the region is that there is a huge commitment to move ahead with aligning the national legislation to the provisions of the Budapest Convention on cybercrime and to the international standards. However, having national legislation in place is not enough, and other capacities for criminal justice authorities are required. If we talk about law enforcement, not enough to have the legislation, the offenses, but you also need additional capacities like institutional developments, training, standard operating procedures to handle electronic evidence or to handle cybercrime investigations, or judiciary. If we are talking about judiciary, some trainings, for instance, it's also something which we provided in our capacity building projects. Council of Europe stands ready to support the strengthening of capacities to fight against cybercrime in the region and any development on the legislation, of course, with support of other of the countries and with the partners from the region, as I mentioned already, the important role played by Australia. I will stop my intervention here, and I will say a few more words later on my intervention. Over to you, Catalina.
Thank you, Virgil. We are heading now for the presentations, but before that, some short details on the house rules. As you may see, you cannot unmute your mic or your video, so you are just in attendees mode. Our speakers will be more than happy to answer to your questions, so do not hesitate to use the section dedicated to question and answers on your right part of the screen. different announcements will be made throughout the entire session, and you will find them on top of your screen on the green, under the green labels. The chat section that you also have available, this is designated to let you interact with the other participants. By all means, use also chat if you want to discuss something particular to us or to ask our supporting team something. Otherwise, questions for our speakers should be addressed in the question and answer section. I don't want to keep you longer than needed. At the end of the three presentations that we are going to have, as mentioned, we will have question and answer session, and I will be the one taking over the questions from the chat. Okay, now going to our first presenter, JK will present how money laundering by virtual assets changed during COVID and how financial crime augmented in this new context. JK, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Thank you, Mr. Spiridon. Thank you, Mr. Lutui, for allowing me to having this opportunity. Also, thanks to Council of your colleagues for all your preparation for this event. Sorry, Catalina, I believe you are going to share my slides.
Yes. In a
Thank
second,
you very much.
And we apologize, we have a slight delay when somebody starts presenting screen. But I think now it's visible. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. So, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Greetings from Singapore. I hope you are well, and I hope your family are well there. Briefly again, my name is Cheong-gi. You can call me JK by the initial. I'm a seconded police officer from Korea, currently working at the Financial Crimes Unit of Interpol. I believe all we are having a hard time in this pandemic. Suddenly, we had to adjust all the new world that we had never experienced before. Many of us work from home. The traditional business has been transformed into an online environment, and the use of social networks has sprung up rapidly. Also, the need for medical supplies is still urgent. At the same time, it's also a new playground for criminals. We are confronting many new ways of crime that have not been explored much before. Among those, let me take shape my topic on money laundering by virtual assets. It's going to be around 20 minutes. This is a story about how we can investigate and how we shall regulate. Shall we begin? Next slide, please. If I may, propose to start from this question: what if all transactions happen via a virtual asset? How things are going to be changed? Maybe people like me won't be able to make complicated bank transfers to other crypto wallet. Actually, I look these phenomena as a development of currencies, or some people even compare this to discovery of fire. Anyway, now we are confronting something virtual. So there's plenty of discussion of terms, actually, virtual currency, cryptocurrency, but please let me follow the term virtual asset, which has been adopted from FATF, Financial Action Task Force, which is an intergovernmental organization developing policies to combat money laundering. For many of you, it may be already familiar. Let me reiterate the meaning if I use the acronym in this presentation. Let me show you this graphic showcasing received from a third party. The graphic now you're seeing, this is some major clusters of central accounts used for stealing the cryptocurrencies. It was Ripple in this case, and a lot of intermediary accounts created for the purpose of laundering to avoid any blacklist. And then in the center, you see the accounts operated by exchange A and B, which have received the majority of funds. Isn't it looks like a tracing banking transactions, which we are more familiar with. This is just a visualization of money flow for our intuitive overview, but there's no bank accounts other than crypto wallets here. I cannot say all transactions in the world are replaced thoroughly by virtual assets, but this is just happening around us, not a very far future, but the reality we are confronting in the pandemic. We are living in a society without contact usually these days, which means that the nature of the payment system will also be affected. I am sharing this to show you how virtual asset is serving financial crimes or cyber crimes, specifically in the field of money laundering, which is growing, highlighted during COVID-19. Let me call those exchanges VASP, Virtual Asset Service Providers, also following the FATF terms. Next, please. Yeah, next, please. So when it comes to financial crimes, traditionally, it's just all about money. And as a cybercrime emerged, we also tried to define something like a cyber-enabled crime, cyber-dependent crime. Honestly, rather than terms, whatever we use, I believe it is much more important that how we responded. Please. Anyway, I want to narrow down the financial crimes on virtual assets. Mostly, we have to think about money laundering. That means any kinds of crimes can become a predicate offense for money laundering by using virtual assets as a criminal procedure. So maybe when we talk about dark web or cryptocurrency, we recall some typical types of crimes: drugs, extortions, scam, but also any types of crime. If you receive the criminal procedure by virtual assets and then move it to another form, it could be a fiat money or another types of virtual assets. It is money laundering itself. That's what I'm aiming for today, and this is the nature. This is the nature of financial or cyber crimes in the virtual assets. With those brief overview, let me continue with what I am doing here in Interpol Financial Crimes. Next, please. Briefly, this is my colleagues in FCU Financial Crimes Unit. Any flags listed, those are not familiar with you. We have 15 officers from 13 jurisdictions. Thanks to our diversity, we are trying to cover many regions and many different time zones. Next, please. We are focusing on case coordination and investigative support conducted by our member countries, of course, including Pacific Island countries. And we have many internal and external collaboration works like today. Next, please. And our main responsibility is supporting ongoing investigation in those ways. We communicate with our member countries via our secure network and try to provide a customized solution. Sometimes we invite related countries to find the possibilities of joint investigation. That is the case coordination meeting. Also, we can develop this into Interpol operations level to provide more wide platform. Also, we issue proper notices for the purpose of information sharing. Last March, I remember we disseminated modus operandi of COVID-19 related scam. So if you are listening this from law enforcement, I hope you will be more familiar with utilizing this global platform, which is ready to already activated, and we are ready to support your investigation. Please. So this is one of crime typology that we have found during pandemic. Criminals were digging into people's caring and merciful mind. They say, please show your generosity. Let's help frontline fighters. Even they accepted a cryptocurrency payment by providing wallet addresses. You see the bottom of the screen. So next, please. The case in April. Can you find the difference between the logos left and right? Actually, the right side one is that I took it from WHO official website. Whatever the logo, they accept Bitcoin for a payment with providing wallet addresses. You see, Bitcoin network and donate now. But please don't make it a trial to send here. I already amended it. I'm sharing this as a new modus operandi, which is even providing crypto wallets rather than a traditional bank account. Next, please. Another case in July. In my opinion, this is the most important slide, I think, and all what I'm saying today is all about to explain this. Interpol was requested to support a case of money laundering facilitated by virtual assets. I received a message from country A. The case typology was mixed with crypto hacking. The unidentified suspect created the same hard wallet, this is like a USB from the victims, which stores the user's private keys, which is a critical piece of information used to authorize outgoing transactions on the blockchain network. I can say kinds of your OTP token for your banking transactions. So the hard wallet is the secure hardware portable device like USB that can be recovered by entering a recovery word if lost or damaged. We don't know how he or she replicated this yet, and then the suspect moved the victim's FMB token, name of the cryptocurrency, to multiple wallet addresses. Finally, the suspect transferred all the cryptocurrency to a certain wallet address at a certain exchange. In this way, the suspects took around 20,000 FMB token, which is around 20,000 US dollars for now. What we can do. The problem is, unlike bank account, sometimes we even don't know where to send the request, as it were. Traditionally, we know where is HSBC Bank, where's the Standard Chartered Bank, but the VASP, Virtual Asset Service Provider information is not very well organized yet. Some are listed on the website, while many are missing, because not many countries are regulating or managing them by open. So in this case, by open source intelligence, Interpol figured it out that probably located in country B, so we could determine the recipient where to send the request. In my opinion, this is the point I would recommend to the Pacific Island countries. Maybe in the near future, like the tax haven, I expect those exchanges, VASPs, could move into worldwide regions, including your countries. We should regulate them and drag them into the field of justice. Simply, you can just let them report you and make a list. So we need a legislation. Let's get back to the case again. So country A sent a request to country B in copy with Interpol. We, FCU team, responded by sending a support message to country B with providing prominent criteria based on FATF recommendations. For example, we are asking to country B, do we have such AML anti-money laundering regulations pertaining to virtual assets? Is it true aforementioned the exchange is existing in your country? Kinds of that. And finally, country B has replied with those information above, and the communication has activated under both countries. Investigations still ongoing. Next, please. With keeping in that case in mind, what should be the next step? Let's go back to a traditional way of financial crimes investigation. Usually we are trying to secure transactions through seizure on bank account and analyze ourselves and finalize with arresting actions if possible, which looks quite cool and organized. Next, please. I suggest the same approach to get a tangible idea in intangible situation. In the same way, we will have to secure transaction details. Let's call it a seizure on virtual asset, which means not only the procedural or managerial technical perspective, also we need a relevant info, we need a proof. And we will have to analyze those and trace the flow. Actually, this is the crucial point that we need PPP, private-public partnership. I should admit we are pretty much relying on private sector in this area, which is the biggest difference from a traditional way. So seizure tracing, identifying each part will contain too many issues. So please let me continue with some regulatory approach which will help making this idea into reality. Suppose you are the officer in country B in the case. You received those requests and you checked the exchange is located in your country. What will you do next? Next slide, please. How about, let's think about any regulations on banks in your country. Looking back in the past, I also can recall plenty of regulations in regards to banking transactions. We are giving them such AML, anti-money laundering duty, including KYC, know your customer, SDR, suspicious transaction report, CTR, etc. If I may recall the first question, what if all transactions happen by virtual asset? Do we have enough manners to regulate its transactions, especially in criminal field? I propose roughly we may regard VASP as bank. This is my core idea in this presentation. Next, please. Looks complicated, but quite simple. This is the movement of criminal procedure when using banking transactions in a traditional way. Upper part, you see the money flying abroad from jurisdiction A to B. And the graphic below, you see a typical international cooperation on this investigation to catch up those flying assets. I'm sharing this for your understanding about current status and to discuss what we will need for cooperation in the field of virtual assets investigation. Please. So to stop the illicit flows of criminal proceeds, who is the important player and how they stop the illicit money? I guess banks and law enforcement closely cooperated together to fight against financial crimes occurring in banking transactions. Of course, FIUs and say nothing of other important stakeholders. Actually, this is still not easy when the procedure went abroad, and there's still too many bullet points to be covered in that topic, but let me hurry up and summarize with virtual assets today, please. What I'm saying is, first, PPP matters. Not all law enforcement can do the analysis and invent its own tool to trace virtual assets, in my understanding, or in the progress of learning or implementing themselves. And let me highlight regulatory approach based on FATF recommendation 15, which has adopted last year. Interpol FCU team joined the FATF plenary meeting last year in Paris, and I joined myself in the discussion of implementing the recommendation in each country. I opine VASPs are becoming more important player, and we need proper regulations to make it under control. Next, please. No need to read all of them now. Please see the sentence in yellow. To manage and mitigate the risk emerging from virtual assets, countries should ensure that virtual asset service providers, VASP, are regulated for AML CFT purposes. This is the effort to regulate virtual assets. This is try to drag them into the real world. We are about to set a game rule before all players are welcomed on the ring. I mentioned before, let's just regard VASPs or exchanges as the banks. If so, we need to ensure that they are regulated for AML purposes like the current banking system. Next, please. But how? That means these are some feasible actions to be taken to put VASPs under regulation and supervision. Make a rule who can be the important player and give license before driving on the road. This is regulatory approach. If exchanges have enough information of customer and share suspicious transactions with financial intelligence unit or law enforcement with close relationship, we maybe get closer to the concept that of controlling the risks of virtual assets. Also, if we could earn appropriate information through seizure on virtual assets or exchanges, it will in turn contribute to investigation on virtual assets. Next, please. Okay, this is last slide. I have to admit this is not 100% answer to cover all black money occurring on virtual assets or age of COVID-19 because VASPs are already spread worldwide and this is not covering personal transactions outside exchanges. But this is the least but feasible that we can make a decision for now in your country in order to increase the possibilities of screening virtual asset money laundering. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Over to you, Catalina.
Thank you, JK, for a very thorough presentation. I was very happy to learn the updates from you on this. I was thinking about your example with the banks and thinking of what happened, let's say, 20 years ago with the spread of the financial, of the FATF recommendations throughout the globe. Less countries than now for sure had the financial, recommendations of FATF implemented in the legislation, and maybe even less have them effectively enforced at national level. And this brings us to why it is important to have an effective national legislation in line with international standards. And I think now it's time for me to pass the floor to Virgil, who will present exactly this, the importance of the effective national legislation on cybercrime and how this matter actually became more stringent in current context. Virgil, this is for you.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Can I have my presentation displayed? Okay. For the next 10-15 minutes, I will be talking about the Council of Europe approach on cybercrime, Budapest Convention on cybercrime and its benefits, and also some words about the relevant developments on legislation in the region, which were also supported by the Council of Europe. Next slide, please. When it comes to the Council of Europe approach on cybercrime, probably some of you have seen this triangle. And let me give you a quick explanation on it. So the approach of the Council of Europe consists on three directions. First is with the legislation, and here is the Budapest Convention on cybercrime, which is promoted by the Council of Europe and is the most relevant standard at the international level on cybercrime and electronic evidence. Legislation, as I said also in my intervention, is the first step. It's important because you cannot build up capacities on fighting against cybercrime if you do not have this first step, if you do not have legislation, meaning offenses on cybercrime or investigative powers or provisions on the international cooperation. But I will come back to that in a bit. On this endeavor, we actually were engaged with more than 150 countries around the globe on supporting the reinforcement of their legislation. Basically, we can engage with anyone who is willing to align the legislation with the international standard. Second direction is with the Convention Committee, Cybercrime Convention Committee, also known as TCY. This is a specialized body, specialized because it consists on representatives from the countries, experts on cybercrime coming from different institutions, Department of Justice, Ministry of Justice, prosecutors, law enforcement, or people with cybercrime background, whether it's on the practical side or on legislation. And this is relevant also because it gives the possibility to the parties to the Budapest Convention to participate in the discussion. It's, in a way, it's a unique framework at the international level that allows parties to bring up issues from the national or regional level on cybercrime. And these issues actually are discussed among the experts, and then different reports or documents may come out. I can give, for example, the guidance notes, which are documents to complement, in a way, the Budapest Convention by explaining how the Budapest Convention can be applied in different areas, not only on cybercrime, but also to interpret some provisions from the Budapest Convention. The main undertake for the TCY currently is with the second additional protocol, the development of the negotiations on the second additional protocol, which I also mentioned in my brief introduction. The third direction for the Council of Europe is with the capacity building. It's a sort of circle, because we have legislation, then we have different discussions and clarifications on different methods, and then capacity building to implement this and to support countries in adapting and reinforcing their capacities. This is done by CIPROC. CIPROC is the Cybercrime Program Office of the Council of Europe, located in Bucharest, Romania, responsible for with this task. Actually, it's also a unique initiative at the international level to have a dedicated office for the capacity building on cybercrime. We have, just for you to know, we have about we have 6 projects running by the office with a total budget of around 40 million euros, and about 40 countries covered by our projects on capacity building. Next slide, please. Few words about what is the global context and why we need to have legislation, and not only legislation as a part of the effective response to the cybercrime. What we see is an increase on the cybercrime offenses against computers or committed by means of computers. And whether we are talking about new forms of crimes or old forms adapted to the context, like COVID, the cybercrimes committed in this COVID period, and we see an increase. We say an increase of in cybercrime cases because they are reported by the law enforcement authorities, but also private sector. With their figures, they also notice such increase. Another important aspect is the transversal character of the cybercrime. And what we see is that electronic evidence is also very much linked to online environments, to illegal activities committed on the internet. We see that many cases involve, and not only cybercrime, involve electronic evidence. In a recent report issued and discussed at the European level, the average is about 90% of cases are involving a device and therefore electronic evidence. And also the crime in the cyberspace is a threat to human rights and democracy and rule of law. Why? Because we have basically the same principles and same values which we have to respect also in the online environment. How to address these issues? Of course, with an effective criminal justice response, and for that, the criminal justice authorities, they need to be properly equipped in order to have such response which must be based on law and meet the rule of law requirements. Sometimes in the online environment, the boundaries are not boundaries for the jurisdictions are not very clear, like in the physical world, and therefore there is a need for clear regulation also on that for the online environment. And as part of this response, what we need to have is legislation to qualify the illegal activities committed on the online environment, legislation to give the law enforcement authorities investigative powers, instruments, because of course these instruments, legal instruments, should be complemented also with other capacities and technical instruments for these authorities to be able to pursue with investigations. Of course, we have these powers should be limited by conditions and safeguards. And last but not least, international cooperation, because cybercrime is also a transnational issue with connections on different jurisdictions, illegal activities, suspects being located in some jurisdictions and victims in different other jurisdictions, and therefore the international cooperation is required. Next slide, please. Few words about the Budapest Convention on cybercrime. I said that is the most relevant international track, please. Go back to the. Okay, thanks. That is the most relevant, and there are also other international treaties on cybercrime, but this one is the most complete and relevant because it contains provisions on substantive law, procedural powers, and international cooperation. These three elements which are very relevant for the legislation when discussing about cybercrime and electronic evidence. For the substantive law, you see here a list of offenses which are covered by the Budapest Convention. You might ask, yeah, but we don't find here like ransomware or phishing attacks or other fancy illegal activities committed on the online environment. But I guess this is also a benefit of the Budapest Convention by using neutral terminology. And this way, we may say that the Budapest Convention is up to date, because in the way the offenses are formulated in the Budapest Convention, they cover also these activities, although the terminology, this sensitive terminology, was not used because it's obviously they were not there 20 years ago when the Budapest Convention was drafted. And on top of that, there are also definitions of some important terminology, like for the computer data, computer system, subscriber information, traffic data, service provider. So these definitions actually help in clarifying the offenses, but also for the investigative powers when it is necessary to get access to data, especially when we talk about traffic data or subscriber information. Procedural tools, they basically address the securing and getting access to data, because when we speak about electronic evidence, it is important first to make sure that the data is secure, because as we know, data stays in the system only for a short while, and therefore there is a need for legal instruments to secure this data. And for that we have, for instance, preservation, which is the legal tool to secure data for a period until the legal process is in place, and then the authorities can get access to data. Then production orders, search and seizures, interceptions of all these instruments, which you can find also in the criminal procedural law for accessing, let's say, ordinary evidence and not electronic evidence, but here are adapted to the context. And international cooperation, we see provisions on extradition, MLA, which might be provisions also for other treaties, object of other treaties, or bilateral treaties between countries, or international treaties. Of course, these treaties, if they exist, they prevail to the provisions from the Budapest Convention. However, it is important to have them in the Budapest Convention because in some parties they might not be in place. And also some specific provisions like spontaneous exchange of information. This is from the Article 26 from the Budapest Convention, which is important in case a country has some information on illegal activities which are going on the online environment, and they might want to share, of course, ensuring confidentiality with another country, and that country might take actions in coordination in order to stop this illegal activity. And this is sort of operational part of the Budapest Convention. Then we have expedited preservation. This applies to the international level. So whenever a party to the Budapest Convention needs to request some data to be secured in a jurisdiction of another party, they can use this instrument, and then the MLA process will follow. MLA for accessing computer data or interception, and also 24/7 contact point, which is a specialized network. And according to the Article 35 from the Budapest Convention, this channel for cooperation allows for advice on technical advice to be provided, preservation requests. So I mentioned about the need to secure data, and this is the tool offered by the Budapest Convention to send preservation requests and enforce them. And also collections of electronic evidence which can be processed through this channel. Next slide, please. So just to briefly summarize what I just said about the Budapest Convention, few of the most important benefits. It's a Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. It's a criminal justice treaty and also operational treaty. Criminal justice because it addresses criminal investigations and does not address neither cybersecurity nor national security. Operational because it helps also and facilitates the cooperation at the operational level between the countries. I mentioned about the spontaneous exchange of information between countries, and 24/7 contact point, just to make examples of how the Budapest Convention works in this respect. Relevant not only for cybercrime, because with the provisions on procedural powers on electronic evidence and also international cooperation instruments, relevant also in other crime areas, but also with the offenses, because as we know, in cases, in criminal cases, quite often we see not only, let's say, in a cyber, take for instance a terrorist attack, we might see also cybercrime offenses in that attack, or whether some critical infrastructure has been targeted, or some other illegal activities conducted on the internet, like internet fraud to finance the illegal activities of the terrorist group. So there is also relevant in other crime areas. Up-to-date treaty, I said that the terminology used by the convention is a neutral one, which makes it very useful also in the context of the development of the IT. However, the convention and the provisions, although does not contain the fancy terminology, it covers these offenses. And Also, we see that it's up to date because there is a great interest from the countries to follow the provisions from the Budapest Convention, and also we see the effectiveness of the legislation in the countries who are parties to the Budapest Convention. Participation in TCY, it's important because I mentioned about the second additional protocol. Countries can also be part of this international effort and be in contact with all the developments on cybercrime legislation and capacity building at the international level. And capacity building program. So once a country is committed to align with the national legislation, with the provisions from the Budapest Convention, then can benefit also the capacity building programs of the Council of Europe. Next slide, please. This is just a picture about the reach of the Budapest Convention. There are 65 countries parties to the Budapest Convention, so where the convention was fully implemented. Additional countries, 3 additional countries would sign but not ratified, so did not complete the process, and also 9 countries invited to accede, the latest one being actually New Zealand. We see also other 20 countries with the legislation or draft legislation, existing or draft legislation in line with the Budapest Convention, and other states engaged with us in developing the legislation in different stages. So more information can be found on our website about the legislation. We have a report on the legislations, status of the legislation of the global level. Next slide, please. As regards the situation in the region, cybercrime situation is not much different from other regions. Of course, we see more or less the same types of illegal activities. Of course, it depends. Would be more cases or less cases in different illegal activities, but also the financial impact. What we see also, it's a huge potential for the IT developments in the region, but also the criminals are also interested in trying to exploit it. Digitalization, which is a priority for the governments worldwide and also in the region, and I guess COVID-19 somehow accelerated the movement towards the digitalization. I mentioned about the cybercrime landscape. There are no differences from other regions. What we also noticed is a strong commitment to reinforce the capacities to fight cybercrime, especially on the legislation for the countries in the region. However, there is limited experience and resources, and therefore the process might look a bit slow. Next slide, please. And to conclude with some developments which were also supported, developments from the past years, reported also by the Council of Europe. Tonga, these are just a few examples. Tonga, which is party to the Budapest Convention, and activities were supported by GLACY project and implemented in the country. New Zealand, I already mentioned, has been invited to accede to the Budapest Convention. Fiji, with the legislation in line, being sitting in Parliament, so GLACY Plus also supported them in this process. Vanuatu, also with the legislation in Parliament in 2018, an advisory mission on legislation was conducted also by GLACY Plus project in the country. Papua New Guinea, with the legislation also in line and expressed formal interest acceding to the Budapest Convention. Samoa, with legislative reform on cybercrime, supported also by GLESI Plus in 2018, and Kiribati with ongoing engagement with on the existing legislation with the Council of Europe and Australia from this year. This is all from my side. Thank you very much. Back to you, Catalina.
Thank you, Virgil. Our participants started to write us questions in the chat section. I would suggest to take two of them, one for Virgil and one for JK, before passing to Patricia's presentation, because they are somehow very linked with your presentations, Virgil's and JK's. I would suggest starting with the one for Virgil. Somebody asked us, unfortunately we do not have the name of the person, but somebody asked us, having in mind that some of the Pacific Islands are in different stages of drafting their cybercrime bills, what kind of technical support we can provide for these jurisdictions during these COVID-19 lockdowns?
As I said, we basically can support any country interested in aligning the legislation with the Budapest Convention. How we translate this support is by engaging with the country, with the stakeholders from the countries, those who are responsible for drafting the legislation and also enforcing the legislation, to provide us whatever they have in place as legislation. We can do a review of what is on the existing legislation and then come up with some written recommendations. We can organize also an workshop with the key stakeholders to discuss on the existing legislation, to explain about the recommendations, and also guide them on the process on that. This is for the legislation. As regards the other capacities, as I said, there is need for a commitment from the countries to align the legislation, and once this is complete, then we can proceed with additional capacities like trainings or institutional developments, standard operating procedure, interagency cooperation, and all sorts of activities in relation to developing the capacities of law enforcement and criminal justice authorities.
Thank you, Virgil. If I can complement to that, from the perspective of GLESI Plus project, as you've seen in Virgil's presentation, we already supported some Pacific Islands countries to adjust their legal framework on cybercrime. Starting with March, we had to be very flexible and adapt to the new conditions. And finally, we identified ways of working with countries, a tailor-fit way to work with each country depending on local conditions. Virgil was mentioning the studies. We used to do that, and for example, we gave feedbacks on those desk studies or on the cybercrime bills on various workshops, and those workshops, depending on local conditions, could have been organized with all the participants, so in a hybrid way, with all the participants gathered in one place locally, and with us connecting remotely as we are doing now, or connect remotely with all the participants from their offices or from their homes. So mainly that depended on the local conditions. We also delivered a lot of numerous trainings on cybercrime, also on the request of the countries, and we did that remotely or in hybrid mode, where we had local trainers supporting us with delivering the message on the ground. So basically, this is what we did lately in Glacy. And as you saw already in Virgil's presentation, there are some countries, and I really hope that in the participants list we also find colleagues with whom we work with. Actually, we had some activities during 2020 in the Pacific Islands, specifically to review and support the drafting of the cybercrime bills in those countries. If I can move now to the question for JK. Okay, so the question is, if a country requests a tracing of origins of a criminal activity like money laundering by a group of investors into another country, how long does it take to provide advice? And further, and can Interpol flag and advise a country if they know of some illegal activities happening, for example, money laundering, without the country knowing? So this is actually 2-in-1, JFK, for you. Please.
Thanks for the question. Actually, I found this a very interesting question, which is very important, and I was trying to type the answer, but thank you for the opportunity. I think I had better explained verbally. So the first priority is finding the adequate partner timely and bridging those. So in terms of providing advice, usually we are responding quite fast because traditionally we are managing banking transactions and we are trying to respond 24/7 because stopping illicit payment it is all about speed. But in terms of virtual asset, it could be a bit take some time, but we will try to respond very fast. And while we are limited on analyzing ourselves, so that means we are not doing analyze ourselves. But in terms of providing some manual or providing some platform, in my understanding, not in FCO, not in Financial Crimes Unit, but Interpol Innovation Center, other colleagues, they prepared such manual for law enforcement investigators. So, and they are preparing such somehow easy tool for law enforcement can easily adapt from their side. I believe it is going to be released very soon in November, so almost coming soon. And the second bullet, actually, I understand this question that Interpol can approach something is happening in your country while the authorities in that country is not knowing. So I can say for the intelligence phase, we can share something is happening in your country, or we can share it with related member countries for as information. This is not any mandate, but and in the case I mentioned, country A and country B, actually the intervention from Interpol is that we can say on behalf of one of another member countries, we are relaying this request, and we can add some criteria or a prominent point from our perspective as well. So that's how we are doing such coordination. So I can say, yes, we can intervene appropriately. Thanks.
Thank you, JK. This is good news. I would suggest to go back to the presentation and ask Patricia to continue with her speech on the perspective of the criminal justice, on the impact of COVID on cybercrime, and then we can resume back to questions. We have some more of them in the chat. Anyway, in case we won't be able to answer to all of your questions, we will make sure that after the webinar, we come back to you with the answers. So no questions will remain unanswered. Thank you. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Hopefully, oh, there we go. There's my presentation. Thank you, Catalina. And it's great to be here today and great to see so many of you here today as well. My views, I need to say at the outset, because I'm employed by the Government of Western Australia now, My views during this presentation are my own, and they're not of those of my former or current employers. So I've spent a large part of my career as a prosecutor with the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. I've worked in the Adelaide and Perth offices of the CDPP in Australia. I have a huge interest in cybercrime and have had involvement with PILON projects before, more recently presenting in Tonga. So I have very fond memories of presenting in Tonga. Some of the attendees' names look familiar, so I'm hopeful that you'll enjoy today's presentation. One of the key things I want people to take home from what I have to say today is how important it is for us to be passionate in this area. The Budapest Convention currently has 65 signatories, but it really is up to us as the people at the forefront of combating crime generally that need to drive legislative change. And we also need to be involved in that change. We bring stories from the front line that should be feeding into the drafting of legislation and the preparation of legislation. We should be agitating for the provisions that are going to be able to help us do our jobs better. So if you're not passionate already, I'm hoping the presentation will somewhat spark a bit of a fire in you to help not only your own country, but those surrounding you as well, as I had the wonderful opportunity to do when I assisted Tonga in preparing legislation in order to accede to the Budapest Convention. So let's get started. Next slide. So COVID-19 has connected us in ways that we've never really been connected before. It's actually forced and pulled us further into the future than we were ready for. And nothing demonstrates that more than my own workplace, for example. I like to tell war stories, to talk about how did my current workplace with over 176 lawyers deal with a new paradigm in terms of how we do our work as government lawyers. We still operate on a Citrix system, so we were allocated tokens as lawyers, but unfortunately we weren't geared up or ready for a global pandemic, which meant that a lot of legal staff had to work from home, etc., and had to have the appropriate software and Citrix licenses to do so. So what COVID did is it pulled us into the future, but it also exposed our vulnerability. I like to liken it to swimming in the ocean and all of a sudden the water pulls out like a tsunami. Everyone saw just how vulnerable all of us were in terms of being able to cope with being forced to work from home or being forced to live our lives in a different way, but not exactly having the technology to help us do that. So we must socially distance, and we have different situations globally as to whether those rules are strict or are being relaxed. So in Australian states and territories, we have Western Australia, which has only just recently had some litigation and has had complete closed or hard border, not allowing anyone into the state whatsoever unless it's for a specific purpose and unless it fits into a certain exemption. For example, law enforcement or defence reasons, or if you are a first responder or if you have family emergencies, etc. So Western Australia's border is only going to reopen on the 14th of November. So it's been closed for quite some time to other states and territories unless you had an exemption. So social distancing is going to be different for all of us globally in terms of what rules we have to work within and just how risky the virus is in our own country. Some countries aren't affected at all. There might be a lot of nations through the Pacific that haven't had any exposure whatsoever to COVID, but nonetheless still need to put in place measures to protect themselves against it. So when I go to work in the morning, there's 4 dots in every lift. And it's amusing to watch people to see whether or not they're going to still adhere to social distancing rules, which means only 4 people in the lift. And the amount of times I've gotten into a lift and there's about 11 people in there, completely ignoring social distancing rules, which are there to condition us. So laws are there to regulate our behaviour, but they're there to also condition us to prepare ourselves for when, for example, COVID becomes a bigger problem for us than it was originally. So some nations that might not have COVID still need to put things in place to regulate people's behaviour to prepare for the risk of it coming into a country. And it's just interesting to watch people's behaviour. Initially in March and April, in Australia in particular, there was a a big sort of activity around, oh my goodness, we don't know what COVID is and we don't know the risks. And so everyone was very cautious and sticking to rules, sticking to the laws. There were hardly any prosecutions for anyone breaking the rules, for example. And if there were, they were on the front page of the newspaper here in Perth in particular. Gradually, as you moved into May and there was a relaxation in Australia and people were returning to work, you saw a relaxation in people's attitudes, and people started to think, oh, the risk is not that bad here. We're very safe. Perth is one of the most isolated cities in the world, so you can imagine how people just started to modify their behaviour. So COVID for me, as a lawyer, as a former prosecutor, has been a very interesting exercise in watching human behaviour. We have to socially distance, but we also need to stay connected to be informed and educated and to go about our daily business. We also needed to be employed. And it's been interesting to see the social dynamics change in Australia, contingent or dependent on whether people continue to be employed and therefore had purpose in life. We have social distancing rules which have moved us into the online realm at a faster pace and at a more intense pace than what we would naturally have done depending on our age bracket. And it's also introduced a lot of people into the internet who would otherwise probably would never have used the internet at all. I'll use a personal example. My mother now uses an iPad. She's in her 70s. She never used an iPad in her life, but she wanted to see her grandchildren, and we just had a new great-grandchild introduced into the family. So, of course, Mum, an Italian, needed to see this child, and she said, okay, I'll adopt and use an iPad and use technology. Now, I hardly think Mum would have got onto an iPad had we not had a global pandemic. That's how resistant she was to using technology. But my mum is not the only person in the world who's new to this. There are a lot of new people to the internet, new people to services on the internet, particularly social services and social benefits. Centrelink payments in Australia, for example, social security payments have become a lot more generous to support those who've lost their jobs. So here you have a lot of people entering into the internet who normally would never have reason to engage in it other than to check things on their phone or have a very casual relationship with the internet. So our connectivity nourishes us. It gives us our mental and physical well-being. I've been in isolation. I've had to travel over to South Australia where all of my family are for family reasons, and I've come back into my apartment and I've had to isolate for 2 weeks. I have a lot of computer and a lot of gear to keep me busy, but humans love interaction. We need to see people and we need to connect. And we're connecting today in a different platform. We connected differently in Tonga in 2018, could see people and could form deep connections. And often when we meet people, we try to continue that relationship online. And now more than ever, in law enforcement in particular, we need to shift our work principally online because of the COVID risk globally. Unfortunately, connectivity means we become more vulnerable. So next slide. So more than ever, we're relying on computers and devices, and we're also relying on more of those. So most of us working from home, particularly in Australia, are using more than one device at a time. When ordinarily I would just take my phone into work with me and have the one device working all day long, I suddenly had a phone, an iPad and a computer and also a work laptop computer all connected to the internet all at the same time because my whole working life essentially changed. So as I just mentioned, there are new and vulnerable users and a different type of use of the internet. So taking another personal example, I was homeschooling my children for a period of time between March and about May in Australia. And what that meant was I was trying to balance effectively work, my duties as a reservist, because I'm a reservist in the Australian Defence Force, and also homeschooling my children. So what that inevitably meant was my children were online a hell of a lot more and a lot more unsupervised. Now, again, I'm not the only person globally where this has happened. A lot of children are using the internet because they're being homeschooled, and parents are very frantic and busy and trying to manage their own employment and caring for elderly parents or caring for others, and then also in addition trying to train and teach their children online and trying to keep them safe. So we have this shift in everyone's day-to-day use of the internet, an increased use of the internet, and therefore a massively increased risk because we have new people who are joining who For example, I've been on the internet since the 90s. So I know not to click on certain things intuitively. When I get online, I see phishing emails and I see odd things, and intuitively I click delete. Well, my mum won't do the same thing when she's in her 70s. If she sees something that says, enter this competition to win $1 million, she's very likely to feel very vulnerable and think, oh, I'll give it a go, and click on it. So we have this difference in internet use, difference in vulnerability, contingent on how you've grown up with the internet, essentially. And you have a whole new raft of people who are joining and using internet devices who may not have that level of protection that would have been built in had they been using the internet for most of their life. So next slide. I really liked all the internet memes that are coming out about COVID, and this is my absolute favourite, more so because this is one of my favourite movie franchises from the 80s, and I really, really wanted a pair of Nikes that would self-lace, and I think Nike has made those, but I don't know if you can buy them in the shops. But can we go back to 1985? And the real question we have to ask ourselves is, where are we going to go, and how are the historians going to write the books about COVID and its impact on us globally? Next slide. So when historians write about 2020, they're going to reflect on how we were pulled into a new technological and connectivity frontier. And there's been a lot of talk and action, particularly in Australia more recently, about pulling us back, as in, you know, airlines want us to travel again. We want to get the economy going again. So employers want us back in the office, and there's been, you know, some reluctance. People actually want to work from home. They don't want to be tied to a desk in an office. Retailers want us back in their shops. Restaurants want us sitting down and eating meals in restaurants. And in healthcare, doctors and nurses want to see us in person. They don't want to consult online anymore. But the real question is, can we really go back? And is our current legislative framework in each of our countries sufficient enough to move forward into the future? My opinion is we will never be going back. This is our new normal, and whatever the new normal is will differ from country to country and from different risks that each country faces. Next slide. So, moving to COVID-19 and its impact on criminal justice. So a criminal or a person who's inclined to commit crime will choose what will benefit them the most. What is the quickest, fastest way for me to get some sort of tangible benefit? And of course, COVID has presented this enormous smorgasbord of new vulnerabilities and new opportunities to be exploited. So we have banks closing their doors. We have the old traditional crime of armed robbery, and a person goes to a bank, holds up the teller, takes cash and runs. Well, we don't have that happening because of security and measures that have evolved over the years, but people will innovate and find new ways to steal, to take what's not theirs, to benefit from and exploit the vulnerabilities of others. So cybercrime has always been the quintessential transnational crime. This is because you don't have a convergence of a victim, an offender, and the benefit or proceeds of crime all in the one place. You'll have a victim in one country, an offender in another, and the proceeds being shifted constantly from country to country to country. So that makes law enforcement really, really difficult. Police officers arresting a person who has robbed a bank will have that difficult task of pre-CCTV days, talking to witnesses, going to see each of them. What did you see? Oh, I saw a person with a yellow hat and blue thongs, and he held up the teller and he took $100,000. Right, you go and ask another witness and they'll give a separate account. Then the introduction of CCTV came along, you had different types of evidence, and you were able to say to a bank, okay, give me camera 2, camera 5 and camera 7 please, I need the last 7 days. We have a money launderer on our hands and they're transacting $10,000 at a time to avoid Australia's anti-money laundering legislation. So CCTV became the key piece of evidence. We then moved to modern times and we have transactions occurring at a pace that our law enforcement bodies are just unable to keep up with. We have an old and archaic system of mutual legal assistance between countries, frameworks where countries haven't quite caught up to one another, and what that means is we have challenges in terms of people being able to use the law effectively to stop, prevent, or investigate cybercrime as and when it occurs. It's also an incredibly expensive exercise to investigate modern crime. Next slide, please. So investigations and prosecutions were already costly enough and were already complex enough before the pandemic hit. Now there's an even greater cost and an even greater risk. Now, law enforcement in Australia is divided into states, territories and federal law enforcement. They do work together on joint operations as and when their resources permit them to. But one of the key issues with COVID is the shift to a perspective of dealing with the healthcare risk that the pandemic posed. And what that did was dismantle police officers and other law enforcement persons away from projects on cybercrime or transnational crime or organised crime and into the front line in dealing with healthcare issues. And I presume the same has been the same globally, and from my reading globally, that's in fact what's happened. And there's been a greater integration of defence forces working with law enforcement in order to combat what is a common enemy, which is the pandemic itself. And in order to protect the community, and the key thing to protect at the moment is health. So COVID has therefore created new opportunities because law enforcement are distracted. They're dealing with the frontline health issue, and they've been removed from ongoing projects which have actually taken years to set up. So one of the biggest things I saw the pandemic do is dismantle a lot of really great work that had already been done in terms of progress in fighting cybercrime, because resources necessarily had to be diverted elsewhere. Next slide, please. So what happened on the ground in Perth? Again, I'm going to talk about war stories in my own backyard and hope that you take something from the examples that I'm giving. So media reports in April, and trust me, if you were like me in the height of the pandemic in your own country, or if you haven't had the pandemic in your own country, I'm pretty sure you've been saturated with internet content and news and constant feeds of information about the virus and what's happening globally. I became glued to my own devices, trying to work out, trying to keep my children safe, trying to keep myself safe, trying to make decisions about my family as to what was safe for myself in terms of going to work physically or working from home. Some of the approaches that workplaces have had have been quite delayed in the sense that families have felt the need to take themselves out and work from home before an office or before their employer was actually ready to take that step and make that decision for them. So around April, I was consuming a lot of media trying to work out what was happening in my own backyard in Perth in Western Australia. And I read some interesting articles which said in April that the crime rate in Perth dropped substantially. But when we talk about the crime rate, we need to be careful about statistics. What are we looking at? What are we measuring? Are we measuring reported crime? Are we measuring in terms of regional localities? We need to be, saying that the crime rate has dropped, we need to be cautious and sceptical and look behind to the data to see what in fact has changed. So the WA Police, which is the state police in Perth, and they do work in concert with the Australian Federal Police, but on joint operations, and it's a fairly rare thing that they work together. It just depends on funding and arrangements. But the WA Police concentrates on street-type offences or street crime. So burglary, stealing from motor vehicles, property damage and stealing offences apparently went down by about 40%. Now, the reason for that, and I live in the city centre of Perth, so I could actually visually see and hear how quiet everything became. So from the rowdy Friday nights to everyone out and everyone enjoying life and socialising and being out and about with friends and family, it suddenly was like a pin would drop and you could hear it, or I could hear it from my balcony. So visibly, I could see and hear it myself. WA Police come out with statistics and say street crime, or what should have been happening around the streets of Perth, had decreased by 40%. So what was happening instead? What would the people that would normally commit those offences be doing? And WA Police also interestingly recorded an increase in family violence by 5%. But I've studied criminology and I've studied crime statistics, and you really need to be cautious of statistics in the family violence area, particularly because victims are incredibly vulnerable and will not report what's happening to them. And globally, I'm sure you've digested some articles or you've seen internet content that is talking about an increase in family violence because of the proximity of families, proximity of a perpetrator and a victim being forced to isolate together in a home when ordinarily they would have breaks in their relationship and there would be an ability for a victim to seek the help that they need. So 5%, I look at that with great scepticism, because how on earth is a victim going to report a crime when they're sitting in the same lounge room as their perpetrator? They're going to be frightened to do so and not have the ability to speak on the telephone, for example. So we've had a lot of development of internet sites which will provide people or victims of particularly domestic violence with security and safety and quick exit buttons. But as a visitor of those sites myself to see how they work, they don't always work that effectively. So I think sometimes victims are just too frightened to seek the help that they need, even through the internet. Next slide, please. So there's been a shift in crime. It's always been shifting online anyway. So we talk about cyber-enabled crime, so the use of computers to commit offences, and that is essentially, more and more over, in particular the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen this large shift online. But then with the pandemic and the shift in the dynamic in terms of where we live, where we work, and how we do those things and how we distance from each other, there's been even more of a shift. So the 40%, I take that 40% figure of street crime decreasing. What are those people who would have been committing those offences doing instead? Are they suddenly turning into cyber criminals? I'm doubtful of that. I just think there are people out there who may have just seen the pandemic as being rich with opportunity to essentially do a lot of the crime online that ordinarily they wouldn't have the time to perpetuate, because they'd be in the office all day, for example, or they'd be able to socialise or able to use other outlets in their life rather than, spending a lot of time on the internet thinking of ways to rip people off or take people's money. So we're still measuring it. We're still in the throes of the pandemic at different stages globally, and it's difficult to measure. But we have seen anecdotal evidence of increases in fake websites, the fake spread of information, phishing emails and text messages which prey on people's additional layer of vulnerability during the pandemic, malware tactics, and I've seen myself an increase in spam generally. And then there's an increased exposure of government and corporate networks because of the shift from office-based working to home-based work-from-home arrangements, where you don't have the security patches being run and you don't have your IT guy on your shoulder saying, Patricia, have you run your antivirus software today? We would have emails reminding us that, as a government worker in Australia, I'd have a reminder saying, update your software. But often I was homeschooling, working multiple jobs, trying my best to just keep my head above water, and honestly, sometimes those patches are the last thing on my mind in terms of priorities. So we have this increase in vulnerability because we're largely working from home and we don't have the staff to monitor and secure our internet working environments. Next slide. So any criminal activity usually relies on exploiting a vulnerability. So now we have a state globally of people who are either distracted or highly anxious. People are seeking informations and entitlements from the government, for example. So they're getting onto government websites in ways they've never accessed them before. They're just trying to get a payment because they've lost their job, they've lost their employment. They're trying to get subsidies taken from their electricity bill, for example. So what this creates is an environment that's ripe for fake emails. The amount of spam I am currently receiving from fake Australia Post because of the increase in parcel delivery services. So everyone is trapped in their homes ordering online items that they would normally go down to the shops on the weekend to go and buy themselves. And there's this increase in traffic from fake email addresses pretending to be Australia's postal service, Australia Post. So again, we go back to the example of the elderly who may not, the first time they've picked up an iPad has been in the last 6 months or so. And they're probably more inclined to trust a logo like Australia Post because they've grown up with it. And they think, oh, well, this email looks trustworthy. It's got the Australia Post logo. Away they go and click. answer a few questions, and all of a sudden their bank account is compromised. And getting them to explain what they've done, if they have to report that to the police, you know, the scale of it, number one, is going to overwhelm law enforcement, who, as I said before, is battling on a massively different front. It's putting aside projects on cyber and on dealing with internet-based crime and working with the front line and keeping people safe from the virus itself. So there's been some recent work by Professor Rob Broadhurst, who is from the Australia's National University, and there's a link on the slide there, and I'll provide the slide deck to Catalina so you can click through to the links and have a read in your own time. But Rob's been writing he wrote a submission to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Law Enforcement Inquiry into Criminal Activity and Law Enforcement during the COVID-19 pandemic here in Australia. And at the end of my slide deck, I've got a link to that inquiry. They're currently receiving submissions. So Australia at the federal level is looking really carefully at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on crime in Australia generally. And Rob is seeing some interesting activity happening in online markets, or more those that are on the dark net, in the continued distribution of narcotics and more dangerously than ever. And before I left the Commonwealth DPP, there was an increase in importation or posting, people buying off darknet markets and posting themselves items such as fentanyl or the even more deadly carfentanil. These are synthetic opioids or drugs that are manufactured rather than grown organically. So traditionally you had narcotics such as cocaine and heroin, which come from plants and which have been used for centuries for pain relief, so we know the risks involved in organic substances which, for want of a better word, come from nature and so have a profound impact on humans, but have an impact that we're aware of because we've studied it for centuries or for years, and we know the effects of them. Synthetic drugs, fake drugs that are manufactured, things like methamphetamine as well, becoming higher in purity level, we don't know the risks involved in them. And carfentanil is a drug that will sedate an elephant so that there can be a medical procedure undertaken on that animal. So you can imagine the strength of that that item as a substance, and we have young people importing or purchasing it online. We've had cases in Perth that I've been involved in of nurses overdosing on fentanyl because they're walking into toilets in hospitals and they're administering fentanyl as the strongest pain relief that they can give, usually in palliative care as well, and they've become addicted and they will rip open sachets and sort of lick and consume it as a drug. It's quite insidious, and its effects are just really dangerous. So we have both obviously illegal importations of it, but we also have needing to manage the distribution of it through the hospital networks for pain relief. So Rob's looked at that. He's also looked at and studied the changes that are happening in organised crime syndicates throughout the Indo-Pacific arena as well, in terms of them innovating and continuing to push illicit drug exportation and importation, which again has become locked down because our borders are closed. So you think that our borders are secure, but there's a lot of even between Australian states and territories, there's a lot of people still trying and innovating to get drugs over and through the different states and territories because, of course, the price has gone up, hasn't it? Because demand is up and supply is low. Next slide, please.
Patricia, if I can intervene a little, we are in a slight delay already. I would relate to some questions in the chat, if you allow me, because some of
Absolutely.
them are quite linked with what you are presenting. You were talking about the increased use of social media. One of our participants is asking, having in mind that some of the governments see cybercrime legislation as one of an attractive means of suppression of social media, particularly when it comes to be critical, what measures should Rafters adopt to ensure effective cybercrime laws do not impact freedom of expression? I mean, this is a question, of course, for all panelists, not only for you, but maybe you can start if you want, and afterwards we can stop here with the presentation and see if we can take another question or we just do the closing.
There's always a very fine line between legislating to protect people from the effects of cybercrime and legislating in a way that impacts on people's freedom of speech. Where we have groups such as Anonymous or groups that want to send a political message using the internet, there needs to be regulation of that kind of conduct, because ordinarily those kinds of political types of messaging might happen by way of putting up, or shutting down websites and putting up sites in place of, for example, a Coles supermarket website gets defaced by Anonymous who wish to perpetuate some sort of political message by dismantling a corporate structure's website. And at the end of the day, they're trying to trade more than ever online, and they're prevented from doing that because they've had an attack on their site. Now, regulating commentary, I mean, ultimately we have different countries who will have different policies in respect to their citizens and what they can say online and how they express themselves. So, yes, there is a very fine balance between it. In terms of draft provisions in cybercrime legislation, the Convention does outline in detail provisions that are predominantly aimed at the gathering of evidence. They create substantive offences where you can't misuse the internet to harass or intimidate a person, for example. So there will need to be, implementation in the different countries of legislation that does still protect a user on the internet from being abused, for example, or harassed or threatened or intimidated, but still enables people to express or put up commentary in respect to either political process, etc. Now, obviously, we have countries in the world who operate unilaterally to prevent social commentary and suppress social media platforms. There's a lot of talk about ownership of various social media sites and risks in terms of gathering of data. People uses data through social media platforms as well, and regulating that is becoming more and more complex. But yeah, there's a very difficult line between protecting people on the internet but still enabling them to use it to communicate and express themselves and have that freedom of expression. It's a really fine line.
Thank you, Patricia. Would any of the other speakers would like to add something to what Patricia said? Otherwise, I would suggest we stop here on the questions. We will make sure that all of them will be answered after the webinar. We are running a little bit late, and we do apologize to everybody for being, I think we are already 10 minutes late, and also to Mr. Lutui to keep him waiting with this delay. So I think now we can move to the closing remarks. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you our speakers. The floor is yours.
Sorry, I'm a very patient man. I don't want to cut off Patricia's presentation, and I'm sure my colleagues here in the Pacific will not mind spending a few more minutes just for Patricia to complete her presentation before I make my closing remarks. If everyone's agreeing.
Thanks, James. I will go to a slide if my presentation can go up, because my next slide is a call to arms to all of you. In speaking about just see if my presentation can be put back up. If not, I'll just keep going. So I mentioned, if we can go to slide number 16. Yeah. And I was just going to mention just a couple of anecdotes about the criminal justice system and lawyers and what we've been facing here in Australia, some interesting war stories really quickly. Maybe if we just go to first, sorry about this, we can maybe just go to 13. So work trade. Slide number 13, here we go. So everyone's had to make a really urgent shift of how they work, including courts, including prosecutors, police officers. We've had matters before the courts that have now been delayed quite a lot. So we already had delay in the criminal justice system before COVID, but COVID has caused adjournment upon adjournment, cases being pushed into the future. We've had our juries removed in the sense that they would come in weekly to be able to sit on cases and hear and determine cases with judges, and unfortunately, because of COVID risk, that has had to be postponed well into the future. So judges, chiefs of every jurisdiction in Australian states and territories are really struggling with this now, because we had a system that was already under pressure, and now there's even more delay. And as we say, justice delayed is justice denied. We have a lot of people sitting and waiting for their matters to be tried. So you're innocent until proven guilty. You often get bail, but if a matter is very serious, you're remanded in custody. So of course our prisons have had to accommodate social distancing rules within very confined spaces. So in the criminal justice system in Australia, there's been quite a massive impact in terms of how we do things, and we were already behind as it was, and now COVID has set us behind even further. Giving you a little anecdote, my children laughed at me because I finally got to appear in court from my car. Now, you might agree with that or you might disagree with that, depending on how you view courts. And lawyers normally have a passion for the solemnity that a court provides in the criminal justice system. We go to court to publicly denounce someone's behaviour. We have a process. In Australia, our courts are open, so most of the time, as a base rule, you can walk into any court in Australia and observe as a participant, and you can watch what's going on. Principle of open justice. Courts will only be closed when there is a public interest to close them, when a victim, for example, is a child, or where there is a need to protect national security information, that kind of thing. But it's very rare, and there are a lot of steps that need to be gone through in order for a judge to say, I'm sorry, you can't enter my courtroom today, I'm dealing with a very sensitive matter and you're not allowed to watch. So COVID has caused this flurry of activity around courts and around accepting participants in the system appearing in different ways, either by video or by telephone. So one of my court appearances was an adjournment. I had to pick my children up from school. I did my best to stay by my telephone in my study at home as long as I could, but then my kids would have been waiting for me. So I hopped in the car, took the risk that they were going to ring me, and sure enough, they did. So when they did, I pulled the car over to the side of the road, appeared in court by telephone, took 10 minutes, I finished, then I pulled into traffic again and went and picked up my kids. My boys thought it was hilarious, but it made me reflect as a lawyer. As I was driving my children home from school, I thought, wow, you know, I'm a female, this works really well, this is flexible working at its best. I've just appeared from car court, as my boys now call it. They call it car court. But as they joked about it, I thought about it and thought, do we want our courts to be car courts? Do we want to lose that solemnity of having a judge stare at someone and say, what you did was wrong, I'm sending you to prison? Do we want to be interacting on screens when we are at the pinnacle of the criminal justice system, and if someone is charged with something that carries 10 years imprisonment as a penalty, do we really want to tell someone through a screen that they're going to prison for 10 years or that they're not going to get parole? Or, you know, so it made me reflect on that as a lawyer and made me think, am I a traditionalist in the sense that I think a courtroom brings solemnity, or can we as criminal justice participants morph and adapt to what we've got and do everything through the internet and basically never see each other? In terms of security, it's great. There are reduced needs to protect people when they're appearing from their own living room, for example. So we've seen some examples of lawyers all dressed up in their traditional court attire, and they're actually, you know, only wearing a shirt and they're not wearing a full suit, that kind of thing. There's memes on the internet about it. So everyone's has had to adjust. But I think all of us who have some sort of role in law enforcement, we should reflect on how we think moving forward we would like things to work. If you were charged with a criminal offence, would you want to be told through a screen that you're going to prison for a very long time? Or is the whole purpose of creating a court, having it publicly open, publicly denouncing conduct, is that the key thing that actually prevents that conduct happening in the future? And will people who have justice by TV screen just think, oh, well, you know, I got a slap on the wrist, but no one was staring at me and I was on a computer screen. I'm not going to pay any attention to any of that. So we've had a really interesting impact there. Bail. A lot of people were seeking bail on the basis that they would be exposed to COVID in prison, or in prison on remand. So in Perth, Western Australia, we have a remand prison called Hakea Prison, and there are a lot of people in there waiting for trial. So again, you're innocent until proven guilty. You are remanded in custody on matters where offences are incredibly serious, and there is a real need to protect the community. But you had this argument where a prisoner, or not a prisoner, sorry, an unconvicted person, a person who had not yet been found guilty, was on remand, innocent until proven guilty, and was telling the court, you need to let me out because I could die because I could get COVID in prison. So there's some really interesting literature on the internet about bail and the impact of COVID as well. So moving along, because I know we're running out of time, the next slide, please. So our connectivity now, in terms of us now doing a lot of our important work in the law enforcement realm online, means we need to commit even more to the Budapest Convention, what it stands for, and the need for all of our nations, no matter how small, no matter how big, to have both procedural and substantive. And by that procedural, I mean investigation of provisions, powers of law enforcement officers such as warrants and telecommunications intercept warrants, that kind of thing. And substantive, that means offences, cybercrime offences. We need to commit to both, and the Budapest Convention provides the framework for that. We need more than ever to lobby and make sure that we do adopt the provisions of the convention and the additional protocol, which is now being negotiated, in asking for the tools and the legislation that we need to investigate and prosecute cybercrime. Now, humans will innovate when we are in crisis. Now more than ever we need to innovate, and now more than ever we also need to collaborate. Now, those are buzzwords that are going around globally, the need to collaborate, but I can't stress more than ever, now we have increased opportunities to talk to each other. Pre-COVID, I'm not quite sure I'd be able to present to all of you today. I'm so pleased that I was able to, again, drop my boys off at school, waltz through that door behind me, log in and talk to, almost 50 of my colleagues globally. This has just been a delight to do today, and I'm really pleased to have been invited to do it. Next slide. And I promise this is the end. But as I said, the Budapest Convention is the framework that will bring us closer together. Laws, they say, are like sausages. You do not want to see them being made. Now, sausage is delicious, and when you bite into it, you think, yum, but if you have to go to the butcher and watch it being made, you probably will never eat a sausage again in your life. Laws are much the same. I was absolutely thrilled to work with my Federal Attorney General's Department and the Attorney General's Department of Tonga in bringing together Tonga's substantive and procedural cybercrime legislation. I have to say, I left the Commonwealth DPP 2 years ago for a new job opportunity working for the WA government, but I do miss my job dearly. And one of the aspects I miss dearly is working with my international counterparts and having the opportunities to draft Tonga's legislation. It was such an exciting process, and to be able to deal with colleagues in another country and listen to the issues they were facing and trying to craft their legislation in a way that suited them has been an absolute highlight of my career. So if you are in law enforcement and you do have the opportunity to work internationally, embrace that, because not all jobs let you do that. I currently work for the WA state government, so I'm really kind of limited in what I can do. But I'm so happy I can be part of PILON and continue to contribute to important discussions that we need to have. The second additional protocol to the Budapest Convention has got me really excited, because this is moving us into that frontier that we really need to be in, which is the quick and easy dissemination across countries globally. Our mutual assistance legislation in Australia is very clunky, very difficult, very hard to follow unless you're a trained prosecutor and you've been dealing with it for years and years. This additional protocol will help to dismantle the red tape, will help law enforcement officials share information in a much faster and more dynamic way. So I say evidence is increasingly ephemeral. What that means is, if anyone's ever used Snapchat, you chat and it disappears unless you take a screenshot. You have increasingly evidence that is disappearing the moment it's created. So our laws and our frameworks are just too exhausted and too tired and too old to deal with that kind of tracing of evidence. So now more than ever, we need to use the simple device on our phone. Our phones are, firstly for a telephone to be able to ring people. The second thing they were able to do was take photos. So now more than ever, we're snapshotting and doing screenshots of evidence because we have to capture it. So I, at the end of the day, had involvement in drafting Tonga's legislation to accede to the Budapest Convention. I urge you as law enforcement officers to feed back your experiences in investigating, potentially even prosecuting any offence, any cyber-enabled offence, and cybercrime in particular. Feed back your experiences, because the laws can only be drafted in a way that's going to help you if you tell the legislators, look, I'm sorry, I have this case, you see, and I wasn't able to do X, Y, and Z because the law didn't let me do that. So your case studies, your war stories are so critically important, and you need to feed them through to your supervisors and talk about what you need in your legislative framework to enable you to do your job effectively. So I put some resources up on there, some further reading. These are just sites that I've been looking at myself more recently, because it's hard for me to stay in this space when I've got other commitments that I do in terms of my job with the WA government, and also as a reservist I'm with the Royal Australian Air Force as well. So I love spending time in the cyberspace. Thank you so much for having me. I've had a wonderful time, and I'm so pleased to see so many of you joining us today. So I wish you all the best. Next slide has got my contact details. I'm more than happy to take queries, questions. I'm happy to mentor people in their cyber careers, talk to them about where they want to be next, because I think this is an exciting frontier to be on. Be passionate about the work that you do. Feed back information about the struggles that you're having. I had seen in the attendees list some of my colleagues from the Australian Federal Police, which I was really pleased to see. And also people from the Australian Cyber Security Centre, so I've got a link up on the system there. In terms of, I'll just talk about just one quick last war story. I did leave the Commonwealth GPP 2 years ago, and you know how I said justice delayed is justice denied? Well, a case that I approved charges on and worked really closely with our WA police colleagues, their technological crime section, I think approved the charges around about October 2018 before I left. A jury has only just found the person guilty. He was an IT director, and he faced prison for essentially deleting a database of client data because he was feeling a bit annoyed at being sacked from his job. Now, it was a difficult cyber case, but can you see how I left 2 years ago and we're only getting finality in the matter now? So these things take time. I just say, yes, they take time, but that shouldn't stop you being passionate about what you're going to do. So I wish everyone all the best in their careers and all the best in their plight to get their countries to see to Budapest Convention, and ask for help if you need it. There's some questions they're saying, there's different Pacific islands in different stages of drafting their cybercrime bills. Ask for help, because you'll get help. And the Council of Europe's here to help you. The cybercrime program is here to help you. So ask, and you shall receive, I hope. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Catalina.
Thank you, Patricia, and also for an excellent wrap-up on the topic of the webinar. I'm not going to keep you waiting. We already exceeded a lot. Just a small logistic from our side. When you exit the webinar, you will be prompted to a feedback form from our colleagues in PILON. We kindly ask you to take it. It will help them to understand further what are your needs in terms of future activities. And I think it will not take more than 2 or 3 minutes to go through it. This is all from our side. I am turning now to Mr. Lutui for the closing remarks. Mr. Lutui, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I wish to first thank our presenters, speakers today, JK, Virgil, and Patricia, for the very informative presentations and imparting your experience and knowledge to undoubtedly all the participants of the webinar today. It is quite unfortunate that we had to do this virtually. If it were up to me, we would all be here in the Kingdom of Tonga, enjoying the hot sun and perhaps having a beer. But jokes aside, I'm sure that investigators, police officers, prosecutors and lawyers and communication experts who have participated in the webinar today and will be listening to the recording will greatly benefit from this discussion as they navigate a world that will simply change us overnight. The webinar has given all of us much to think about, but before we depart, I would like to thank Sasai and Rosie from the PILON Secretariat for their hard work in putting this event together. I would also like to thank Catalina, Matteo, and Elena, and everyone else from the Council of Europe for hosting and organizing. I would also like to thank all the PILON members and friends of PILON who have participated in this webinar today, asking questions in the Q&A section, which has helped us create an interactive dialogue, bringing this webinar into fruition and making it more constructive. That's all I wish to say for now. I wish to say malo, alpito, and lofoa. Thank you and goodbye.